This month we're working on just one block. It is a beehive block, and in your kit you have a sunflower background, 5 different golden browns for the beehive, and a black square that will be a heart in the middle of the beehive. It is applique again. I showed you a start and press method last month, and you are absolutely welcome to use that method. You can also use the fusible method or whatever other method you like. But I just figured that since this is supposed to be educational, I would show you another method of applique this month. I'm going to use freezer paper again. And once again, you can get freezer paper in the box in the grocery store, or here in the store we have the 8.5 by 11 sheets that you can pick up and run through your printer. Now, in most cases, when you're using this freezer paper method, you are going to want to trace a mirror image of what you are putting down, because the freezer paper is going on the wrong side of your applique fabric. So to do that, you can use a light box like I have here and trace from the wrong side. And again, just like last month when I'm tracing, I'm not putting seam allowances around the outside edge. I like to use a mechanical pencil because that way I don't have to keep running and sharpening my pencil. And she has already added your seam allowances in on the bottom. So I'm going to trace all my shapes just like that. Now I did say most of the time you're going to want to trace a mirror image. You don't have to use a light table. You can take your pattern to a copier and copy a mirror image. You could also use a window. You could trace the design onto the back side and then trace that way without a light table. When I say most, if the design is symmetrical, then you could trace from the front side. Any other time, if you want your like an animal or a person facing a specific direction, make sure you trace from the wrong side. On this beehive, it really wouldn't make any difference. I mean, you're not going to tell whether it was traced from the right or the wrong side. My next step is to take my freezer paper patterns that I have traced and cut them out on my traced line. I didn't mention it, but I'm hoping that you remember from month 5, freezer paper has a dull side and a shiny side. I traced on the dull side, and now that I have all my pieces cut out on my trace line, I am going to take it to the ironing board and I'm going to press to the wrong side of my applique fabric using a medium temperature dry iron. And make sure that you leave space around the edges to add your 1/4 inch seam allowance everywhere except for on the bottom of the beehive pieces. On the heart, it'll need to be all the way around. Okay, I've pressed my freezer paper to the wrong side of my applique fabric. And I say press because if you scoop the iron back and forth on the freezer paper, sometimes you can catch the edges of your templates and roll them. I also want to point out on the heart that I gave you a large enough square in the kit that you could put the heart on point. And the reason I did that is because it is much easier to turn curves when they're on the bias. So whenever you can, curves on the bias. My next step is to cut these out, leaving approximately a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I say approximate because when I'm on curves, I usually go a scant 1/4 inch. If you have a big fat seam allowance, it's much harder to turn it under smooth around the edges. My seam allowances can vary depending on how complicated the piece is. You don't want it so narrow that you have nothing left to turn or that it's going to fray and come undone after it's stitched down. Now, to help me get everything centered when I'm putting it on the background, I'm going to put a cross in the middle of my pattern. It's 8.5 inches across, so halfway is 4 1/4. And any ruler that'll get you the 4 1/4 will do. One 1/4. So right there should be my center mark. On the background, your piece in the kit is larger than it says for your cutting instructions. Don't cut it down before you do your applique. When you applique, sometimes the stitching can draw the block up and make it a little bit smaller. On my background, I also want to get that cross mark. You can finger press or you can take it to the iron and lightly press. We don't want it to be there forever, so if you take it to the iron, don't put a permanent crease in there. So I can see it. Next, we need to have some method for placement on our background. You can certainly use a light table. However, a light table is not portable, and the nice thing about applique is it is portable. So some other options are an overlay. You can use clear plastic vinyl, which is what I'm going to demonstrate today. There are interfacing type products. This one is Do So, that are fairly transparent that you could also trace onto. You can use overhead transparency sheets and just put them through your printer, and then you wouldn't have to do any tracing. Just make sure if you do that, that you get the ones that are made to run through the printer. Otherwise, the ink smears when it comes out of the printer. So I'm going to use the clear vinyl, and I recommend that you mark with a ballpoint pen. A Sharpie or anything that's a felt tip type pen will smear as you're working with it. So all you're doing is just tracing right over those lines with your ballpoint pen. There's my overlay all traced out, and I'm not sure whether you can see because of the glare, but I did also mark my cross in the middle. So now I can take my overlay and put it over the top of my background fabric, and I'm going to line that cross up with my creases in the background fabric. And then I will take my first piece, peel back the overlay, and center it under the overlay. And remember, there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance on here, so that's going to be beyond my marked lines. When I'm happy with the placement, then I will use applique pens to hold it down while I'm stitching. And I just sort of hold it in place, peel back the overlay, and put my pens in. I always use at least 2 pens so that my applique pieces, even if they're tiny, can't twist. So that's my placement for that piece, and I'm ready to stitch. So last month you should have had an opportunity to play with the size 11 straw needles, and if there's anything that was frustrating about them, it was probably threading the needle. So I have a couple of products here to show you. They're both needle threaders. This one is a desk needle threader, and this one is more like a lipstick case that you can throw into a carry-along bag when you're traveling. And this one will work as well, and I thought I'd show how both of them work. I'm going to start with the desktop needle threader. There is a hole in the top where the needle goes eye down into it, and then your thread goes right here into this crease. It's pulled in, and then just press the button and pull it out, and you'll see there's a loop through the eye of the needle, and you can just pull that through, and your needle is threaded. The other needle threader works much the same way. In the top, there's a small hole, and again, the eye of the needle goes down into that hole. Whoops, you want it straight up and down. And on this side, there's a clear plastic piece. Your thread goes above that into that slot. And then gently push the button. Do not force it or you will bend the threader. Pull this out. And again, you have the loop in the needle, or in the thread. You just pull on through. Now, I do want to say that on the size 11s, when they start, the straw needles, when they start getting bent, they may not work with the needle threaders anymore. With the start and press method that I showed you last month, your seam allowances are already turned under, so all you have to do is stitch it down. With this method, you are turning your seam allowances as you stitch. So I'm going to start here because this is left open, and I just use the edge of my needle to turn under just ahead of where I'm stitching. It is exactly the same stitch as I showed you last month. I come up in the applique, down in the background, rock the needle, back up, just catching a couple threads in the applique. Now the mistake that a lot of people make when they're doing needle turn is they're trying to turn too far ahead where they're stitching. You're only turning maybe a ½ inch ahead of where you're stitching, especially when you're on curves or points. So let's just stitch and turn, stitch and turn. And I'm not necessarily turning every time, but I'm right here on this curve. So. And you're using your thumb on the hand that you're not stitching with to hold that fabric in place or to crease it. And for applique, good lighting helps. If you're sitting on a couch or in a chair, a couch cushion, not cushion, but a pillow, something small to lift your work up closer to you helps. So I'm going to just keep stitching all the way till I get to this side and have everything stitched down. Okay, so I've stitched from here to here, and now I need to take my freezer paper out. If you don't, if you have a shape that's enclosed, some people do slit the background fabric and go in and take the freezer paper out. That's not my preference. I feel like it weakens the quilt. So I like to use a hemostat or forceps. And on this type of shape where you have that big an opening, it's not going to be really necessary. Long tweezers would also work, but you can just go in and get the whatever device you're using between the freezer paper and your applique fabric and loosen it. And just because sometimes I have a smaller hole, the hemostat works better for me because I can grip it and close it. And just pull the freezer paper out. You're not usually going to be able to use it again in this method because a lot of times it rips. And then all I'm going to do is just baste this closed here. You wouldn't have to. I just don't like it flopping out there, getting in my way. Piece number 1 is all stitched down, so I'm ready to move on to piece number 2. Again with the overlay. And this time I can not only line up my cross here, but I can also line up my first applique piece. Again, I'm just going to slide the next one under. And remember, we have that 1/4 inch-ish seam allowance that's going all the way around except for on the bottom. When you're happy with where it is, you can just peel back the overlay and again pin it in place, and I'm going to stitch it exactly like I did the last one. The shapes are just getting bigger. So I've added each layer of the beehive, following exactly the same process as for the first 2 layers. Use the overlay for placement, stitch it down, remove the freezer paper, and I like to baste the bottom closed, and you probably can't see it, but I don't like it flapping. And then do the next one. Our last step is to add the heart onto the beehive. I do want to show you the heart first. I have cut it out, leaving about 1/4 inch all the way across, around. You'll see that I cut off, leaving, and that might still be too much, but leaving just a straight edge down here. I want to reduce the bulk into sharp points. Also, on the heart, on the inside point, I'm going to take a sharp pair of scissors and just take a clip straight down into there, stopping a couple threads before the edge of the freezer paper. And then I once again use the overlay. And I'm not really lining up with the creases anymore. I'm just lining it up with my beehive. Slide the heart under. This one's going to be even harder to see because it's black. And when you're happy with the placement, remove the overlay and pin in place. When I'm stitching a piece that is going to be closed using this freezer paper method, I like to start and stop on as straight a spot as I can. So with the heart, I'm going to do it on one edge. Go ahead and just turn under where I want to start. I like to bury my knot between the background and the applique. So I just come in that crease, and then I just stitch away. Remember, you're not trying to turn it way ahead of where you're stitching. Just a little bit at a time. So now I'm coming up to the point, and I want to stitch right up into that point. And to be able to see where it is, you may need to bend your freezer paper over and make a crease. So there's my point right there. I'm going to take a stitch exactly into the point. And then I'll turn the fabric flat first. Again, you might want another stitch just right into that point to hold it. And if you'll pull your thread out a little bit, that'll also help pull the point straight. And then up here, I need to fold in that whatever bulk is there. And that's why I wanted to cut out as much as I could. Manipulate it till you're happy with it. And I'm going to take another stitch just really close to the point. Hold all that right where I want it. And then you're off again, just on the straightaway. I'm up on the outside curves here on the heart. They're a little bit tighter than the curves were out here on the edge. You should not need to clip as long as you stated a scant 1/4 of an inch for your seam allowance. But you may need to have your stitches a little bit closer together as you go around this curve to keep it smooth. So just be aware of that. I'm coming into my inside point now, and I'm still just working on just this edge. I'm not worrying about turning this yet. So use your needle to get it turned down in there. And I want to stitch right up to that point. I am going to do a stitch right before it. And at this point, I'll probably start turning the other side. And a stitch right into that point. If you're worried about it fraying, I don't usually worry too much about it. You can use some fray check or some fray stop right there. Don't just squirt it out of the bottle. Get a little bit on a toothpick or something and just dot it on that spot. So once I put the stitch right in the point, I want another one right next to it. And here's my heart. What it should look like, sort of, is a stitch coming straight down in and then a stitch coming off on each edge. So sort of like a chicken foot, but obviously not that big, just catching your edge. This is where I started stitching, right about here, and I'm here. If you will remember, I said I do not like slitting the back to get the freezer paper out. So I'm going to take my pins out and turn the rest of the seam allowance the rest of the way. And you're not going to be able to see this on camera, but if you just breathe on it, your air is warm and moist, so it acts like a mini steam iron. Then just hold it between your thumb and fingers, and you'll get a crease. Once you have that crease so you can see to where to finish stitching, we're going to get that hemostat out or forceps again. Peel back the applique fabric enough. Get the tip in there between the freezer paper and the applique, and just grab a hold of it and pull it out. And now we have that crease as our guide for the rest of the way. So I just keep stitching on down until that gap is closed, and then knot it off on the back. We're finished with the stitching, but we still need to finish up the block. Once you've appliqued something, it'll look even better when you press it. I prefer to press from the wrong side On a soft ironing surface, if your ironing board is not soft enough, you could always fold up some bath towels and iron on top of that. We're actually not ironing, we're pressing. Just like we've talked about before, it's up and down motion. You don't want to wiggle back and forth, or you run the risk of stretching your applique. And after working so hard to get it smooth, we don't want to press tucks into it. Okay, so once it's pressed, we are ready to trim it down. This block is supposed to be 8.5 inches square. It is much easier to square up a block if you have a square ruler that is at least as big as the block is supposed to be. If it's bigger, that's okay. Now you can just put the ruler down on here and trim it down to 8.5 inches. You've heard the rule, measure twice, cut once. Well, sometimes even that is not foolproof. So a technique I learned from Crabapple Hill's patterns, when you're all done with embroidery in their patterns, they have you cut a piece of freezer paper that is the finished size of the block, then center it on the block, and if you put it over a light table or over a window, then you will be able to see. Then iron that onto your block, and then you're going to just cut around the edges of that freezer paper. So let me go ahead and press this down. I did hold it up to the window to make sure I had the block centered, and I also want my cut edge to be right along the bottom of the beehive. Now, just because I have my paper piece cut doesn't mean that I just go ahead and cut without measuring. I still like to put my ruler down, and especially if I'm using this freezer paper template for more than one block, because you can cut off a sliver. 8.5, 8.5. Going to cut off this side, reach around the camera, cut off this side, and rotate. And I still make sure that I have 8.5 inches here and here. Cut off. Cut off. And now I can peel my freezer paper off, and because of the freezer paper, I know exactly how my block was going to come out. It's centered the way I want it the first time without saying, oops, I cut off too much on this side. So that's our beehive block.